Good morning, everyone. My name is Fadhel Kaboub. I'm an associate professor of economics at Denison University, currently on leave and based in Nairobi, Kenya, with PowerShift Africa. Unfortunately, I couldn't be with you this morning. I'm currently traveling in Quito, Ecuador. Thank you for the kind invitation and for hosting this important conversation. So the question I wanted to bring to your attention for conversation today is the following. Can Chinese innovation and entrepreneurship transform Africa? And I'd like to suggest a Pan-African vision for sustainable prosperity. And the short answer to this question is yes, but under specific conditions that I'd like to lay out in today's presentation. So with that, I would like to bring to your attention this report that I had the pleasure of co-authoring with the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development, which is a group that was convened by Dr. Yuba Sekona, who's the outgoing vice chair of the IPCC. And it's called Just Transition, a Climate, Energy, and Development Vision for Africa. It's available online, justtransitionafrica.org. And what we try to do in this report, and I'll explain why it's relevant to our conversation, what we try to do is to put together a coherent, comprehensive vision that simultaneously addresses the climate, energy, and development policies that are needed to transform the African continent. And the question that we have before us today is, what is the role of innovation, green innovation? What is the role of entrepreneurship? What is the role of the private sector in general in transforming the African continent? So before we get to the role of the private sector and the guidelines that governments need to put in place, the vision that governments need to put in place for the private sector to transform the continent, we need to understand the nature of the economic development engine that has dominated the global South in general, but Africa in particular, over the last several decades. And here, what I want to do is focus on the structural economic deficiencies that we struggle with. So we know what the transformation is, and we know what is the role of government and private sector in that transformation. So, of course, everybody's familiar with the problem of external debt that many of our countries are struggling with today. And of course, it's important, but external debt is actually a symptom of much deeper structural issues that can be summarized in these three major root causes. Number one, energy deficits. Number two, food deficits. And number three, what I call manufacturing deficits or low value added industrialization. Energy deficits. What I mean by this, I actually include a country like Nigeria, which is a major exporter of oil, but Nigeria today imports 100% of its gasoline, not by accident, but by design. And this is true for many other countries that rely on extractive industry. So Nigeria exports crude oil and imports the more expensive petrochemicals, the gasoline, the kerosene, and other petrochemicals. Food deficits, according to UNCTAD, Africa as a continent imports 85% of its food. Again, not by accident, by design, because we used to be the breadbasket of the global north during colonial times. And as soon as we gain independence, we fell into this trap of relying on exporting cash crops to generate dollar revenues in order to import the core crops that are heavily subsidized by the global north since the 1960s. I'll give you an example. The European Union's major pillar, economic pillar, is called the Common Agricultural Policy, which was introduced in 1962, which is a system of heavy agricultural subsidies to European farmers in order to produce much cheaper wheat and corn and barley and soybean and so on. And that forced African farmers to give up the production of corn and wheat and barley, and switched to exporting cash crops. And that put us in a position of severe food insecurity, as most people have discovered over the last couple of years after the supply chain disruptions due to COVID and the disruption of shipments of food supplies from Russia and the Ukraine and beyond. And finally, the third and most important structural deficiency that we struggle with is the fact that we've been assigned the role of either being a purely extractive economy, we export raw materials, or manufacturing that requires importing capital equipment, importing the intermediate components, importing the fuel to power the factories, and even importing the packaging for the manufactured products. So we end up importing high value added content. We export low value added content using low cost labor, racing to the bottom. So no matter how much you double, triple, or quadruple your exports, you're always locked at the bottom of the global value chain. So you take the energy deficits and the food deficits and the manufacturing deficits. Of course, it adds up to structural trade deficits that weaken our currencies relative to the dollar and the euro. And with currency depreciation, with the weaker currency, anything we want to import the next morning, whether it's food or fuel or medicine, is going to cost us more. So we literally import inflation, especially in the food and energy sector. And that leads to a very dangerous potential for social unrest, political unrest when you have food and fuel price inflation. And that puts our governments in defensive positions, using band-aid solutions to do two things. Number one, we subsidize food and fuel to protect the most vulnerable people. And number two, we ask our central banks to borrow dollars in order to stabilize the exchange rate, artificially stabilize the exchange rate. And that starts feeding into the debt crisis. So the solutions for transforming the African continent on the economic front are staring us in the face right there. The solutions are strategic investments in food sovereignty and agroecology, strategic investments in renewable energy sovereignty, and strategic investments that will move us from the bottom of the value chain, and that is strategic industrial policies that will transform the continent from a low value added manufacturing sector to higher value added industries over time. So the role of any foreign investment in the continent that will actually serve the needs of the continent and transform it will have to be channeled and targeted towards those three areas. And therefore, the role of the private sector, both domestic and foreign, and the role of innovation and the role of entrepreneurship has to be, again, channeled towards the roots of the problem in order for us to transform the continent and create the win-win type of situation for both African economies and our international partners, for the private sector domestically and internationally. And that should be the focus of our conversation. But in order for us to get to that point, it's very important for the African leadership to create this vision and set the guidelines and push all the international cooperation, whether it's technical or financial, to channel resources towards this kind of transformation. But let me show you some of the numbers just so we understand this on a macro, on a global scale. If you divide the world into global north and global south, and you net out all global financial transactions, including trade and interest payments and remittances and foreign direct investment, you find that green line, which is the net amount, which is $2 trillion, moving from the global south to the global north. That is the nature of the global trade, investment, and finance architecture that we operate within. And therefore, the transformation of the African continent also requires a different kind of international financial architecture, trade architecture, which I personally don't expect the World Bank or the IMF or the WTO to change the rules of the game in order to favor the global south. What we need to do is create our own global south focused international trade, finance, and investment architecture that transforms the global South in the way that I suggested today. And that would make the existing international financial architecture irrelevant to the point where it has to cease to exist or transform itself to rebalance the global economy in ways that are fair and equitable to the global South. But more specifically, when you summarize this in the context of the global climate finance conversations that tend to dominate global debates today, the summary is the following. You have $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction. You have $100 billion promised almost 15 years ago, and most of it was not delivered. And whatever was delivered is in the form of loans and that perpetuate the debt trap. And you have the Green Climate Fund that barely has $11 billion in it the last time I checked. And of course, there's the Loss and Damage Fund that remains empty to this day. Hopefully during the COP28 meeting, we'll have a proper framework. But the amounts that people are talking about are in the low billions, when the structural transformation that we need requires trillions moving in the right direction. And that is the sad reality of where we are today. So we can't ignore these underlying structures when we talk about transformation in the African continent. And here's a quick summary of what I just discussed. So Africa's exports, you can see the volume there is 585 billion. You can eyeball the composition of Africa's exports. It's a lot of raw materials, lots of cash crops, and low value added manufacturing. And then when you look at Africa's imports, notice the volume is 737 billion. That's the structural trade deficit I explained. And look at the composition of Africa's imports: core crops, refined petrochemicals, pharmaceuticals, and high value added manufacturing. That is the structural deficiencies that we need to transform on this continent. And I can pick country after country to show you the numbers, but here's an example. Ghana, you can again eyeball the problem right there, lots of raw materials and cash crops and low value added manufacturing. The volume of Ghana's exports is 25 billion. The volume of Ghana's imports is 27 billion. And again, look at the composition of the imports: core crops, pharmaceuticals, high-tech products, and refined petrochemicals. And of course, that creates Ghana's constant pressure on the exchange rate to weaken. So Ghana's currency devaluation or currency depreciation in recent years is not recent. It's a structural problem that has been going on for a while. And of course, the flip side of this is Ghana's central bank desperately borrowing dollars and euros, trying to stabilize the exchange rate. But of course, you can't stabilize an exchange rate of an economy that is structurally weak and structurally deficient. So the structural solutions, to summarize, is South-South strategic cooperation in three fundamental areas. Number one, investments in food sovereignty and agroecology. Number two, renewable energy sovereignty investments, and that is manufacturing renewable energy infrastructure for deployment on the continent to deliver electricity to the 600 million people on this continent who don't have any access to electricity today, to deliver clean cooking infrastructure and technology to the 970 million people who are inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis, mostly women and children. And that's the opportunity for industrialization that we have on this continent to plug that third major deficiency that we have. The opportunity that we have is that we have all the critical minerals, the strategic minerals, for leapfrogging into a clean energy era, for leapfrogging into a clean cooking era, for leapfrogging into a high-tech industrial era. We have all the strategic minerals. We have the complementarity of resources and capabilities on this continent, and we have the market demand at scale, which is what you need for industrialization. You can't industrialize in a small domestic market. And that's why Pan-African cooperation with technical assistance from China, from other foreign partners on African terms, in order to transform the African economic engines on those three fronts: food, renewable energy, and manufacturing. And the role of innovation comes in within this framework of transformation. The role of entrepreneurship comes again within this framework of transformation. Otherwise, if we use the existing engines of economic development that we've used over the last several decades, and we feed them more finance and we accelerate those engines, they will continue to produce the same deficiencies on a larger scale. And that's our opportunity here. And that's my call for cooperation between African economies and China in particular in the renewable energy sector, is to establish a set of working groups that will design specific investment projects that will take Africa's strategic minerals from the raw stage to the processing stage to the manufacturing stage, to manufacture clean energy infrastructure, not to produce electricity for export to Europe, which is unfortunately the reality of major investments that are happening today, but to manufacture the clean energy infrastructure to deploy on the African continent, to manufacture the clean cooking infrastructure, the clean transportation infrastructure, the high-speed rail manufactured on the African continent for the African continent. And as you know, there is no country in the world that can function without food, without energy, without transportation. And these are the basic pillars of development that we've been neglecting in the past and that we've always been told to neglect. We should import our transportation system. We've been told we should import our food. We've been told we should import our energy. And that cannot be the future that Africa needs, that Africa deserves. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much. Asanteni sana. Sheshe. Thank you.